Hello everyone, this is Emily vs. Art, and I'm here today to talk about how I make environment thumbnails. First off, on the left we have some reference photos of some cool mushrooms that I like, just for inspiration, and on the right we have some mini canvases. Now first we need to grab a background color, a midground color, and then even though this might be a little bit too strong, I went with full black for my foreground. This is totally up to you, and you can use any color scheme you like. Grayscale is going to work out fine here for us. Now first I need to lighten up my canvases so that when we use the background color it actually shows up, and as you can see here, it shows up pretty well. Now I'm just going to start with anything that comes to mind. Selecting with the magic wand tool will help us keep everything nice and neat. I start off with a classic valley shape where I create a V using my background color and my canvas color, and then I bring in my midground color in order to create another layer of cliffs or rocks. But this time, instead of just having a straight V, I want to create a little bit more detail. So I start adding random shapes. I'm not even sure what they're going to be. Are they rocks, trees, plants? And don't be afraid to pick up your canvas color again and eat away at the background to add more interest to your shapes. Then I grab the foreground color. At first I start with something spiky and I don't quite like it, so instead I start drawing what look like shrugging people, but they're actually hopefully going to be mushrooms. This is really important. As long as you understand what you're trying to represent and the general composition that you want them in, the individual elements of your thumbnail don't need to have as much detail. Now I'm selecting my next canvas, and I want something completely different here. Instead of going with something with strong borders on both sides, I decide to go with a big sloping tree on the right. Then I start to experiment. I don't quite like how this ended up turning out, but that's not the point. I know that here I would like to try to illustrate one of those net-like fungi as I have in the top left. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to represent what you have in your mind's eye well enough that when you come back to it, maybe in a few days, few weeks, or a few months, you have an idea of what you were trying to build. Now, here I start adding some vines. I absolutely love using vines to build depth. In fact, I might overuse them. I finish off with a stick figure climbing down a rope in the foreground. On this next one, I have the image of baobab trees in my head. Big, thick trunks with skinny, weird tops. And so here, for the first time, I draw a straight horizon, and I fill in the background almost entirely below that horizon. I'm going to use the background, midground, and foreground colors together here and mix them in their layers to give gradients of color, show a little bit of highlight, maybe some rougher edges, as you can see in the roots of one of those midground trees. And as I'm doing here, I'm adding some of the foreground color to the road to give a sense of depth, not just with the shape and size of the line, but also the tone. And then I immediately cover it up with some bulging tree roots, which I decide would make a good foreground element. And then of course I go back, and sometimes once I've worked my way to the foreground, I go back and I start to edit the midground to make it a little bit more dynamic with the current composition. Now I'm going to speed things up for the video on screen, just to take up a little bit less of your time. This is another classic sci-fi fantasy landscape where a lone figure is overwhelmed with the floating landscape in front of them. So of course I had to give it a shot and just get the idea down onto a canvas. In this next one, I was inspired by pointy things. Nothing in particular. I just wanted a very spiky, intimidating background that I was looking up to from below. And then I start working in the midground, and here I am drawing inspiration from the strange red fungi on the left, with mouths kind of following the general flow of the painting going up. And so again, I'm no expert on rule of thirds or general composition rules, but I picked up enough to know a little bit about how I want the general shapes to fit together. This is something that just comes with practice and from watching a lot of YouTube tutorial videos. Next, I really enjoyed making those sharp, peaky shapes, so I decided to make a big mountain in the background. And I've decided to start working in some architecture, which is something that I was avoiding because architecture is a weak point for me. When you're working on these thumbnails, don't be afraid to attempt concepts that you are less familiar with. This is where you can experiment without feeling like a perfectionist. As you can see, none of these paintings are particularly painting-like. They are incredibly rough. Also, here I decided to put a little pedestal with a gem because I thought it would be nice to mirror the shape of the peak in the background. My final takeaway that I hope you are getting from this is that it's okay if these zoomed in close-up thumbnails look horrible. It's okay. And even if you only end up choosing one out of the many thumbnails you might create, always save them because you might be able to come back to them later for inspiration on an entirely different project. One thing that is a little bit different between the typical process and what I showed here is that I had no cohesive project in mind. I wanted to create some sort of sci-fi fantasy landscape, and I had plenty of different ideas on how to do that. In one of my upcoming videos, I'll be exploring character sketching or character thumbnails, which will typically be focused on a single character or group of characters, and that is where I'll explore how you can get consistency between your thumbnails. For now, feel free to explore and experiment in your thumbnails, and keep it simple. 3 colors, background, midground, foreground, is enough to get a general shape and composition. Just remember that this should be fun and loose, and it shouldn't be where you are making tiny decisions on details. This is where you want the big ideas to come through. So just relax, have fun, and have a great one.